A wealthy family thought they could humiliate their housekeeper for the way she spoke. They laughed at her accent, mocked her words, and treated her like she was beneath them. But what they didn't know was that this woman had a past they never saw coming. When she finally responded, her words didn't just silence the room. They shattered everything this family thought they knew about power, respect, and who really held the upper hand. This is the story of how one moment of cruelty backfired in the most unexpected way possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montgomery estate sat like a crown jewel in the hills of Westchester County, New York, 3 stories of limestone and glass, with manicured hedges that lined the circular driveway, and a fountain that cost more than most people's homes. Inside, crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, and every surface gleamed with the kind of polish that only came from someone else's labor. Grace Okonkwo had been working for the Montgomery family for 8 months. Every morning at 6, she arrived through the service entrance, changed into her uniform, and began the careful choreography of keeping their world spotless. She dusted the imported Italian furniture, scrubbed the marble floors until they reflected like mirrors, and prepared meals in a kitchen larger than the apartment. She shared with her 2 daughters in the Bronx. Grace had come to America from Nigeria 12 years ago with dreams folded carefully in her suitcase and determination woven into every fiber of her being. Her English was fluent, but her accent carried the music of her homeland, the rounded vowels, the particular rhythm that marked her words as distinctly her own. She'd never thought twice about it until she started working for the Montgomerys. Richard Montgomery was a hedge fund manager who wore suits that cost $3,000 and checked his phone during every meal. His wife, Celeste, spent her days at charity luncheons and spa appointments, returning home to complain about the temperature of the house or the arrangement of flowers in the foyer. Their 2 children, Brandon and Sloane, were in their early 20s, old enough to know better, but raised in a bubble where consequences never quite reached them. The mocking started small. A smirk when Grace said certain words. A repeated phrase, slightly exaggerated, followed by laughter. At first, Grace told herself she was imagining it. She'd worked for wealthy families before, and while some were dismissive, none had been openly cruel. But the Montgomerys were different. It was a Tuesday afternoon when things escalated. Grace was in the dining room, carefully setting the table for a dinner party the Montgomerys were hosting that evening. Celeste swept in, her heels clicking against the hardwood, followed by Brandon and Sloane. "Make sure the silverware is aligned properly this time," Celeste said, not looking at Grace. "Last week, Mrs. Henderson noticed it was off-center. It was embarrassing." "Yes, ma'am," Grace replied, adjusting a fork. Brandon lounged against the doorframe, scrolling through his phone. "Hey, Grace, can you say aluminum for us?" Grace looked up, confused. "I'm sorry?" "Aluminum," he repeated, grinning. "You say it funny, like aluminium." "It's hilarious," Sloane giggled, leaning against her brother. "Oh my God, yes. Say tomato, too." Grace's hands stilled on the napkin she was folding. A familiar heat crept up her neck, not quite anger, not quite shame, but something in between. She'd felt this before, this particular brand of smallness that came from being reduced to entertainment. "I have work to finish," Grace said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "Come on." "Don't be sensitive," Brandon said, pushing off the doorframe. "We're just having fun. Say something for us, anything. It's just your accent, it's so thick." Celeste waved her hand dismissively. "Brandon, leave her alone. We have guests coming." She turned to Grace. "Though he has a point, Grace, you really should work on your pronunciation. It's noticeable. Perhaps there are classes you could take?" Grace's jaw tightened. She'd earned a master's degree in literature from the University of Lagos. She'd taught English to high school students for 5 years before immigrating. She'd written papers that had been published in academic journals. But none of that mattered here in this dining room. With these people who saw her only as the help, "I will make sure everything is perfect for your dinner. Mrs. Montgomery, Grace said, her tone carefully neutral. "See that you do," Celeste replied, already turning away. "And Grace, when you serve tonight, please try to speak as little as possible. Just gestures are fine. We don't want our guests to feel uncomfortable." The words landed like stones. Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and watched the three of them leave the room, their laughter echoing down the hallway. She finished setting the table in silence, her movements mechanical. Her mind, however, was racing. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered prejudice in America, but it never stopped cutting deep. The assumption that her accent made her less intelligent, less capable, less worthy of basic respect. It was exhausting. That evening, Grace moved through the dinner party like a ghost. She served wine and cleared plates, keeping her eyes down and her mouth shut as instructed. The Montgomerys' guests were more of the same, wealthy, comfortable people who talked about their vacation homes and investment portfolios, while Grace refilled their water glasses. At one point, she overheard Mrs. Henderson, the same woman who'd apparently noticed the silverware last week, speaking to Celeste in a loud whisper that Grace was clearly meant to overhear. "Where did you find her? Her English is so broken. Don't you worry about communication issues?" "Oh, she understands well enough," Celeste replied with a dismissive laugh. "And she's cheap. Much cheaper than the agency housekeepers. You know how these immigrants are? They're just grateful for the work." Grace's hands shook as she set down a dessert plate. She retreated to the kitchen, pressing her palms against the cool marble counter and taking slow, deep breaths. She thought about her daughters, 15-year-old Amara and 13-year-old Kioma, waiting for her at home. She thought about the tuition payments for Amara's prep school, the one that would give her daughter opportunities Grace had fought so hard to provide. She thought about the electricity bill, the rent, the cost of Kioma's asthma medication. She needed this job. But as she stood there in the Montgomerys' gleaming kitchen, listening to their laughter drift in from the dining room, Grace wondered how much more of her dignity she was willing to sacrifice for a paycheck. The dinner party finally ended near midnight. Grace cleaned up, while the Montgomerys and their last lingering guests retired to the living room for after-dinner drinks. She washed crystal glasses by hand, dried them carefully, and put them back in the cabinet, exactly where Celeste demanded they go. She was wiping down the counter when Brandon wandered into the kitchen, clearly drunk. He leaned against the doorframe in that same casual way he had earlier, watching her with glassy eyes. "You know what I don't get?" he said, his words slightly slurred. "Why do you people come here if you can't even speak the language properly? Like, isn't that Immigration 101? Learn English?" Grace didn't respond. She wrung out the dishcloth and hung it to dry. "I'm talking to you," Brandon said, stepping closer. "It's rude not to answer when someone's talking to you." Grace finally looked at him. Really looked at him. This 23-year-old man-child who'd never worked a day in his life, who'd never had to fight for anything, who thought cruelty was the same thing as humor. "I speak 3 languages fluently," Grace said quietly. "English, Yoruba, and French." "How many do you speak?" Brandon blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "I asked how many languages you speak." His face reddened. That's different. We're in America. You should speak American." "American isn't a language," Grace said. "And my English is perfectly fine. What you're mocking is my accent, which has nothing to do with my intelligence or my competence. It's simply where I'm from." Brandon's expression shifted from confusion to anger. "You don't get to talk to me like that." "You work for us. I work for your parents," Grace corrected. "And I do my job well. What I don't deserve is to be mocked and belittled for entertainment." She picked up her purse from the chair where she'd left it and walked toward the service entrance. Brandon called after her, his voice rising, but Grace didn't stop. She stepped out into the cool night air, her heart pounding, and walked to the bus stop at the end of the long driveway. On the ride home, Grace stared out the window at the passing streetlights and made a decision. She'd spent 8 months swallowing insults and pretending not to notice the casual cruelty. But something had shifted tonight. She was done being small. She was done being silent. What the Montgomerys didn't know, what they couldn't have known because they'd never bothered to ask, was that Grace Okonkwo hadn't always been a housekeeper, and the woman they'd been mocking had resources, connections, and a story that would change everything. But that revelation would come later. For now, Grace rode the bus back to the Bronx, already planning her next move. Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat at her small kitchen table, laptop open, scrolling through files she hadn't looked at in years. Amara had already gone to bed, but Chioma padded out in her pajamas around 1 a.m, rubbing her eyes. "Mama, why are you still awake?" Grace looked up, managing a smile. "Just thinking, baby. Go back to bed." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Chioma walked over and wrapped her arms around Grace's shoulders from behind. "Did something happen at work?" Grace hesitated. She'd never told her daughters about the way the Montgomerys treated her. She'd kept that ugliness away from them, wanting to protect them from knowing that their mother spent her days being diminished by people who should have known better. "Nothing I can't handle," Grace said finally, patting Chioma's hand. "Get some rest. School tomorrow." After Chioma disappeared back into the bedroom she shared with her sister, Grace returned to her screen. She pulled up her LinkedIn profile, something she hadn't updated since taking the housekeeping job. Before the Montgomerys, before the string of cleaning jobs that had kept her afloat these past 3 years, Grace's profile told a different story. She'd been the director of educational programs for the Nigerian Ministry of Education. She'd overseen curriculum development for over 200 schools. She'd given keynote addresses at international conferences on literacy and educational reform. But when her husband died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving her with 2 young daughters and mountains of medical debt, Grace had made the hardest decision of her life. She'd applied for a visa, packed up their lives, and moved to America where her sister lived, chasing the promise of better opportunities for her girls. The transition had been brutal. Her credentials didn't transfer easily. The positions she was qualified for required American experience she didn't have, certifications that would take years and money to obtain. So she'd taken what she could get. Cleaning jobs, housekeeping positions, work that paid the bills, but felt like wearing a costume of someone else's life. Grace clicked through her contacts list. Names and faces from another lifetime. Colleagues from Lagos, professors from conferences in Geneva and London, education ministers she'd worked with on literacy initiatives. And then she found the name she was looking for, Dr. Patricia Nwosu. They'd gone to university together in Nigeria, had stayed friends even as their paths diverged. Patricia had moved to New York 15 years ago and now ran a non-profit called the Bridge Educational Foundation, which provided resources and advocacy for immigrant families navigating the American school system. She was also well connected in ways that mattered. She sat on boards, attended galas, knew people who knew people. Grace checked the time. Too early to call. But she composed an email instead, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She explained her situation carefully, choosing her words with precision. She wasn't asking for charity or pity. She was asking for information. By the time the sun started rising over the Bronx, Grace had sent 3 emails and made a list of phone calls to make during her lunch break. She showed up at the Montgomery estate that morning exactly on time. Her uniform pressed, her expression neutral. Celeste was in the kitchen when Grace arrived, drinking coffee and scrolling through her iPad. "Oh good, you're here," Celeste said without looking up. "We need to talk about last night." Grace set down her bag, waiting. "Brandon said you were rude to him after the party. That you spoke to him disrespectfully." Celeste finally looked at Grace, her expression annoyed. "I don't know what you think gives you the right to take that tone with my son, but it's unacceptable. He was just having a bit of fun earlier with the accent thing. You're being oversensitive." Grace took a breath, keeping her voice level. "Your son was drunk and confrontational. I simply answered his question about languages." "Don't make excuses," Celeste snapped. "You're the help, Grace. You don't get to talk back. If this happens again, we'll have to reconsider your employment here." The threat hung in the air between them. Grace nodded slowly, saying nothing. Celeste seemed satisfied with this response and waved her hand dismissively. The upstairs bathrooms need deep cleaning today. Richard spilled coffee on the bedroom carpet. Use that special cleaner, not the regular one. And I need you to prepare lunch for 3. My book club is meeting here at noon. Grace spent the morning scrubbing toilets and treating carpet stains, her mind working through the conversation she'd had with Celeste. The casual cruelty of it, the assumption that Grace should be grateful to be humiliated, the belief that having money meant having the right to treat other human beings as less than. At noon, Celeste's book club arrived. Grace recognized a few of the women from previous gatherings, wealthy wives who spent their afternoons discussing novels they'd barely read while drinking expensive wine. She served them the salad and quiche Celeste had requested, moving quietly around the sunroom where they'd gathered. So I told the landscaper that if he couldn't get the hydrangeas, the exact shade of blue I wanted, I'd find someone who could, one woman was saying. I'm paying him enough. The least he can do is get the color right. They just don't care about quality anymore, another agreed. The woman who cleans my house missed a spot behind the toilet last week. Behind the toilet? I had to call the agency and complain. Grace refilled water glasses, invisible. At least you use an agency, Celeste said. I hired mine independently. It's so much cheaper, but the quality is hit or miss. Mine can barely speak English properly. And she has this attitude lately. The women glanced at Grace, then away, as if she weren't a person standing 3 feet from them, but rather a piece of furniture that had briefly drawn their attention. Grace returned to the kitchen, her hands steady as she loaded the dishwasher. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a text from Patricia. "Call me when you can. I have information." During her afternoon break, Grace stepped outside to the back garden, where the Montgomerys never ventured, and dialed Patricia's number. "Grace, I got your email," Patricia said, her warm voice familiar and grounding. "Tell me everything." Grace explained the situation, the months of mockery, last night's confrontation, this morning's threat. Patricia listened without interrupting. "Here's what I know," Patricia said when Grace finished. "The Montgomery family. Richard Montgomery runs a hedge fund called Apex Capital Management. They manage investments for several high-profile clients. Celeste sits on the board of a few charities, the kind where you write checks to feel important but don't actually do any work. Their son Brandon was in the news last year for a drunk driving incident that got swept under the rug. Money and lawyers made it disappear. "Why are you telling me this?" Grace asked. "Because you asked me to look into them, and because I think you should know who you're dealing with. But here's the interesting part. My foundation is hosting a fundraising gala next month. It's a big event. Donors, politicians, educators, community leaders. The theme is immigrant contributions to American education and innovation. We're honoring several people who've made significant impacts." Grace waited, sensing where this was going. "I want to honor you," Patricia said, "for your work in Nigeria, for what you've built here despite the obstacles. You've kept your daughters in good schools. You've volunteered with the Nigerian Women's Association. You've tutored kids in your building for free. That matters, and I think your story deserves to be told." "Patricia, I don't know." "The Montgomerys will be there," Patricia interrupted. "Celeste is on our mailing list. She never comes, but she's on the list. And I happen to know that this year we're featuring several major donors who are friends of theirs. There's a very good chance they'll attend." Grace understood now. "You want them to see me. I want them to see who you really are. Not their housekeeper, Dr. Grace Okonkwo, former director of educational programs, mother, educator, the woman who's overcome more obstacles than they've faced in their entire privileged lives combined." Grace leaned against the garden wall, processing. "And if they fire me before then? Then you'll have unemployment to hold you over while you find something better." "Grace, you're wasted there. You know that, right? You're brilliant, experienced, and you're spending your days scrubbing their toilets because the system is rigged against people like us. But you have options. You've always had options. You just forgot for a while." After they hung up, Grace stayed in the garden for a few more minutes. The September air was crisp, and the trees were just starting to turn gold at their edges. She thought about her daughters, about the life she'd built from nothing, about the dignity she'd maintained even when people like the Montgomerys tried to strip it away. She thought about the woman she'd been in Lagos, confident, respected, powerful in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with knowledge, skill and the ability to change lives through education. That woman was still here. She'd just been buried under the weight of survival. Grace walked back inside, ready to finish her shift. Celeste was in the foyer, talking on the phone, and she pointed at a vase of flowers that needed to be moved to the dining room. Grace picked it up, carried it where Celeste indicated, and went back to work. But something had shifted. The Montgomerys might have thought they'd put her in her place this morning with their threats and their condescension. What they didn't realize was that Grace had just stopped playing their game. She had a month until the gala, a month to prepare, a month to remind herself of exactly who she was before she walked into that ballroom and showed the Montgomerys the truth they'd been too blind to see. The reveal was coming, and it would be entirely on her terms. The following weeks passed in a strange duality. On the surface, Grace continued her routine at the Montgomery estate, arriving at 6, cleaning, cooking, enduring the casual cruelty that had become background noise. But underneath, she was transforming back into the person she'd been forced to set aside. Every evening after work, Grace came home and pulled out the boxes she'd kept in the back of her closet. Papers from her time in Lagos, certificates and awards, photos from conferences where she'd presented research on educational equity, letters of recommendation from ministers and university presidents. She spread them across her kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle she was putting back together. Amara found her one evening, surrounded by documents, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed a paper she'd written years ago on literacy interventions in rural communities. "Mama, what is all this?" Amara asked, picking up a photograph of Grace standing at a podium speaking to an audience of hundreds. "My old life," Grace said simply. "Before we came here." Amara studied the photo, then looked at her mother with new eyes. "You never told us you did all this. You were so young when your father died, and when we got here, I wanted to focus on giving you girls a good life. The past didn't seem to matter anymore. Does it matter now?" Grace smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Yes, it matters now." Patricia called every few days with updates on the gala. The guest list was expanding. Several prominent figures had confirmed their attendance, including a New York State Senator, the Chancellor of the City University system, and multiple foundation heads who managed tens of millions in grant funding. The event was becoming bigger than anyone had anticipated. "The press will be there," Patricia told Grace during one call. "Local news, education journals, a few bloggers who cover non-profit work. This is going to be major." Grace felt a flutter of nerves. She'd spoken to large audiences before, but that was in another context, another country, another version of herself. "What if I mess this up?" "You won't," Patricia said firmly. "You're going to stand on that stage and accept your award and tell the truth about your journey. That's all. Just the truth. The truth." Grace thought about that word. The Montgomerys thought they knew the truth about her, that she was simple, uneducated, someone to be managed and minimized. They'd constructed their truth around her accent, her job title, the fact that she entered their home through the service door. They'd never once asked about her life before, her education, her accomplishments. They'd simply assumed at the Montgomery estate the atmosphere was deteriorating. Brandon had apparently complained to his parents about Grace's disrespect, and now both Richard and Celeste treated her with icy formality. They left notes instead of speaking to her directly. They inspected her work with exaggerated scrutiny, looking for mistakes. One afternoon, Celeste called Grace into the living room, where she sat with a friend, a woman named Victoria, who wore pearls and an expression of permanent boredom. "Grace, Victoria needs some help finding a housekeeper," Celeste said. "I was telling her how affordable you are." Victoria looked Grace up and down like she was examining livestock. "Do you have references?" Grace kept her expression neutral. "Mrs. Montgomery can provide a reference." "The issue is the language barrier," Victoria said to Celeste, as if Grace weren't standing right there. "I need someone who can understand complex instructions. My last housekeeper was American, and even she had trouble keeping up." "Grace understands well enough," Celeste said with a dismissive wave. "You just have to speak slowly and use simple words. Right, Grace?" Grace met Celeste's eyes and saw the challenge there. The older woman was testing her, waiting to see if she'd respond, if she'd give Celeste a reason to fire her before she'd saved enough for next month's rent. "I understand perfectly, Mrs. Montgomery," Grace said quietly. Victoria sniffed. "I'll think about it. What do you charge per hour?" Before Grace could answer, Celeste jumped in. "She's very reasonable. Much cheaper than the agencies." They discussed her rates as if she weren't in the room, as if her labor were a commodity they were haggling over at a market. Grace stood there, hands clasped in front of her, and let them talk. She'd learned that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. Sometimes you had to let people reveal exactly who they were without interruption. When she was finally dismissed, Grace returned to the kitchen and pulled out her phone. She scrolled through the photos Patricia had sent her from previous galas. Elegant venues, well-dressed guests, stages with podiums and spotlights. She tried to imagine herself there, accepting an award, telling her story to a room full of strangers. It felt both terrifying and necessary. That weekend, Patricia invited Grace to her office to prepare. The Bridge Educational Foundation operated out of a renovated brownstone in Brooklyn, and Patricia's office was filled with photos of students, certificates of achievement, thank you letters from families they'd helped. "We need to write your speech," Patricia said, pulling out a notepad. 5 minutes, maybe 7. You'll introduce yourself, talk about your work in Nigeria, your journey here, what education means to you. Grace sat across from her, hands folded. "Do I mention the Montgomerys?" Patricia paused, considering. "Do you want to?" "I don't know. Part of me wants everyone to know how they've treated me, but another part thinks it makes me look bitter, like I'm using this platform to settle scores." "Here's what I think," Patricia said, leaning forward. "Your story is powerful enough without naming them. You don't need to call anyone out specifically. Just tell the truth about being an educated immigrant woman, about the assumptions people make, about the invisible work that keeps this country running. The people who need to hear that message will understand exactly what you're saying." They spent the next 2 hours crafting Grace's speech. Patricia asked questions, drew out details, helped Grace find the words for experiences she'd never articulated before. The humiliation of having her credentials dismissed, the exhaustion of being underestimated every single day, the determination to give her daughters a different future. By the time Grace left Patricia's office, she had a draft speech that made her throat tight when she read it back. It was honest and raw and completely true. The gala was now 2 weeks away. Grace used her lunch breaks to shop for a dress at consignment stores, finally finding a deep blue gown that fit perfectly and cost less than what Celeste spent on a single brunch. She practiced her speech in the mirror, in the shower, on the bus ride to work. She wanted every word to land with precision. At the Montgomery estate, Sloane announced one morning that she'd gotten engaged to her boyfriend, a trust fund kid named Preston, whose family owned a chain of luxury car dealerships. Celeste immediately went into planning mode, talking about venues and guest lists and whether they should have the wedding at their country house in Connecticut. "We'll need to hire additional staff for the engagement party," Celeste said, looking at Grace. "Do you know anyone else who does this kind of work? We'll need servers, coat check, kitchen help." Grace thought about her network, the Nigerian Women's Association, the mothers she knew from her daughter's schools, the community she'd built in the Bronx. People who worked multiple jobs, who sent money back home, who were trying to build lives in a country that often made them feel invisible. "I can ask around," Grace said. "Good, and they need to be presentable. Tell them to dress appropriately. No," Celeste waved her hand vaguely, "ethnic clothing or anything like that." Very professional. Grace's jaw tightened, but she nodded. She walked away before she said something she'd regret, heading to the upstairs bathrooms where she could scrub and think and channel her anger into physical labor. Her phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. "The Montgomerys just RSVP'd for the gala. Confirmed for a table of 4. Grace sat down on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the message. They were coming. They would be there in that ballroom when she walked onto the stage, when she accepted her award. When she told her story, she thought about the moment they would recognize her, the confusion on their faces when they realized their housekeeper was being honored, the slow dawning of understanding when they heard about her credentials, her accomplishments, the life she'd lived before she ever walked through their service entrance. Grace stood up, caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked tired, the lines around her eyes deeper than they'd been a year ago. But there was something else there, too, a spark of the woman she used to be, fighting her way back to the surface. She picked up her cleaning supplies and got back to work. 2 more weeks of scrubbing their toilets, cooking their meals, being treated like she was less than human. 2 more weeks of being underestimated, and then everything would change. That evening, Grace sat with her daughters at their small kitchen table, eating the stew she'd made. Amara was telling a story about a debate in her history class, her hands gesturing animatedly. Chioma was laughing, adding her own commentary. Grace watched them, these brilliant girls she'd raised, and felt a surge of fierce pride. This was why she'd endured the Montgomerys. This was why she'd swallowed her pride and taken a job that diminished her. Her daughters were thriving, excelling, becoming the kind of women who would never let anyone make them feel small. "Mama, you okay?" Chioma asked, noticing Grace's expression. "I'm perfect," Grace said, reaching across the table to squeeze both their hands. "I have something to tell you both. There's a gala in 2 weeks. I'm receiving an award for my work in education." Both girls stared at her in surprise. "An award?" Amara said. "For what?" Grace smiled. "For being your mother. For being a teacher. For being exactly who I've always been, even when the world tried to convince me I was someone else." She told them about Patricia, about the speech she was preparing, about standing on stage and reclaiming her story. She didn't mention the Montgomerys. That part wasn't for her daughters to carry. When she tucked Chioma into bed that night, her youngest daughter looked up at her with serious eyes. "Are you scared, Mama? About the gala?" "Terrified," Grace admitted. "But sometimes the things that scare us are the things we need to do most." "You're going to be amazing," Chioma said with the absolute certainty of a 13-year-old who believed her mother could do anything. Grace kissed her forehead and turned off the light, carrying those words with her like armor. The week before the gala, everything at the Montgomery estate intensified. Sloane's engagement party was scheduled for Saturday night, and Celeste had transformed into a whirlwind of demands and last-minute changes. The menu was revised 3 times. The flower arrangements were sent back twice. Grace found herself working 12-hour days, her feet aching, her patience worn thin. Thursday morning, Celeste intercepted Grace in the hallway with a clipboard and a manic expression. "The caterers will be here tomorrow to prep. I need the kitchen spotless, and I mean spotless. The silver needs polishing, every piece. The guest bathroom downstairs has a loose faucet handle. Get Richard to look at it or call someone. And the wine cellar, dust every bottle. Preston's father is a collector and he'll notice if anything looks neglected." Grace nodded, making mental notes. Celeste thrust the clipboard at her. "Here's tomorrow's timeline. Caterers arrive at 8. Florist at 10. Rental company delivering tables and chairs at noon. You'll need to direct all of them. And Grace, try to minimize your interactions. Just point and nod. Preston's family is very traditional, very—" She paused, searching for the word particular. "I don't want any awkwardness." Translation: she didn't want Grace's accent to embarrass her in front of the future in-laws. Grace took the clipboard without comment. She'd learned that arguing only made things worse, and she was so close now, just days away from the gala, from the moment when the Montgomerys would see her as something other than their help. She could endure a little longer. Friday unfolded in controlled chaos. The caterers arrived with boxes of ingredients and immediately took over the kitchen. Grace directed them to storage areas, answered questions about the ovens and refrigeration, and stayed out of their way. The head chef, a harried man named Marco, barely acknowledged her beyond barking occasional orders. The florist was worse. A thin woman with severe bangs who kept saying, "No, no, that won't do at all," and rearranging centerpieces while her assistant trailed behind her, looking miserable. Grace helped carry in heavy vases, her back protesting, and wondered if Celeste would even notice the effort. The rental company delivered round tables, chairs with white covers, a portable bar, and a sound system. Grace signed for everything, checked items off the list, and directed the workers to the backyard where the party would take place under a massive white tent. By mid-afternoon, Grace was exhausted. She grabbed a bottle of water from the kitchen and stepped out to the garden, seeking 5 minutes of peace. The tent looked beautiful, she had to admit, elegant and expensive, strung with lights that would glow like stars once the sun set. Tomorrow night, 100 people would gather here to celebrate Sloane's engagement, drinking champagne that cost more per bottle than Grace made in a day. "There you are." Grace turned to find Richard standing at the edge of the patio. He rarely spoke to her directly, preferring to communicate through Celeste or notes left on the kitchen counter. His presence now felt ominous. "Yes, Mr. Montgomery?" He walked closer, hands in his pockets. "Celeste mentioned you've been working a lot of hours this week." "With the party prep." Grace waited, unsure where this was going. "We appreciate the extra effort," he continued, though his tone suggested the words were rehearsed rather than genuine. "I wanted to let you know we'll be giving you a bonus. $200. Grace did the math instantly. She'd worked at least 20 extra hours this week at her regular rate. That would be over $300. But she knew better than to argue about money with people like Richard. They decided what her labor was worth, and gratitude was expected regardless. "Thank you, Mr. Montgomery," he nodded, already turning away. "Tomorrow night, once the party starts, you can go home. We'll have the catering staff handle service. Just make sure everything is ready before guests arrive at 7. It was a dismissal. He didn't want her visible during the party, didn't want to explain to his future in-laws why they employed a housekeeper with an accent. Grace understood perfectly. "Of course," she said. That evening, Grace came home to find Amara waiting with news. She'd been accepted into a summer program at Columbia University, a pre-college intensive for high school students interested in international relations. The program was prestigious, competitive, and expensive. "The deposit is due in 2 weeks, Amara said, her excitement tempered by worry. "It's $1,500. "I know that's a lot, Mama. I can try to find a job or—" "You'll do the program," Grace interrupted. "Don't worry about the money. But how?" She wasn't angry. She was past anger. She was resolute. Grace walked out through the service door, got on the bus, and rode home through the city as the sun set. Tomorrow was Sunday, her day off, and tomorrow night was the gala. At home, she laid out her blue dress, the shoes she'd bought, the small clutch she'd borrowed from her sister. She practiced her speech one more time, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, imagining the ballroom, the faces in the audience. The moment when the Montgomerys would understand what they'd missed. Kioma knocked on the door. "Mama, are you okay?" Grace opened the door and pulled her daughter into a hug. "I'm better than okay, baby. Tomorrow, everything changes." That night, Grace slept deeply for the first time in weeks. She dreamed of Lagos, of her classroom filled with students, of standing at a podium speaking words that mattered to people who listened. She dreamed of her husband, of the pride in his eyes when she'd been promoted to director. She dreamed of Amara and Kioma, grown and confident, walking through a world where no one would ever make them feel small. When she woke Sunday morning, sunlight was streaming through her window. Grace lay there for a moment, letting herself feel the weight of what was coming. Tonight, she would walk into that ballroom. She would take the stage. She would tell her truth, and the Montgomerys would finally see her. The Riverside Grand Ballroom occupied the entire 23rd floor of a hotel in Midtown Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the Hudson River, and crystal chandeliers cast warm light across tables draped in gold cloth. Grace arrived 2 hours early, her dress carefully pressed, her nerves humming beneath her composed exterior. Patricia met her at the entrance, radiant in a burgundy gown. "You look stunning. How are you feeling?" "Like I might throw up," Grace admitted. Patricia laughed and linked her arm through Grace's. "That's normal. Come on, let me show you around before guests arrive." The stage was positioned at the front of the ballroom, with a podium and microphone, screens on either side that would display photos during the presentations. Grace saw her name on the program, Dr. Grace Okonkwo, educator and advocate. Seeing it in print made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "You're the third honoree," Patricia explained. "After the welcome remarks and the first 2 awards, you'll be introduced. I'll be doing the introduction myself. 5 to 7 minutes for your speech, then we'll open the floor for the networking portion of the evening." Grace nodded, her mouth dry. She'd memorized her speech, practiced it dozens of times, but standing here in this ballroom, imagining hundreds of eyes on her, made her hands tremble slightly. "They're going to love you," Patricia said, squeezing her arm. "Trust me." Guests began arriving at 6. Grace watched from a side room as the ballroom filled with elegantly dressed people, educators, philanthropists, community leaders, politicians. She spotted the senator Patricia had mentioned, surrounded by a small group. She saw journalists with cameras, bloggers with phones, people whose influence extended far beyond this room. And then, at 6:40, she saw them. The Montgomerys entered through the main doors. Celeste wore a silver gown that probably cost thousands, diamonds glittering at her throat. Richard was in a tuxedo, checking his phone. Brandon and Sloane followed, both looking bored already, as if attending events like this was a chore they had to endure. Grace's heart hammered. She stepped back from the doorway, suddenly feeling exposed, even though they couldn't see her. "They're here," she whispered to Patricia, who had just walked in. Patricia looked through the doorway, spotting the Montgomerys as they were directed to their table. "Perfect. Front and center, table 7. They'll have an excellent view of the stage." The program began at 7. Grace sat at the head table with the other honorees, her hands clasped in her lap. She barely heard the welcome remarks, barely registered the first award presentation to a retired principal who'd founded an after-school program. Her entire focus was on staying calm, on remembering her words, on preparing for the moment. The second award went to a Vietnamese immigrant who'd created a network of tutoring centers across 3 states. Grace applauded automatically, her eyes drifting to table 7. The Montgomerys were talking among themselves, Celeste leaning toward another woman at the table, probably someone from her social circle. Then Patricia was at the podium, and Grace's heart stopped. "Our next honoree," Patricia began, "is a woman whose story embodies the very essence of what we're celebrating tonight. Dr. Grace Okonkwo came to the United States 12 years ago from Nigeria, where she served as the Director of Educational Programs for the Ministry of Education. In that role, she oversaw curriculum development for over 200 schools and implemented literacy initiatives that improved outcomes for thousands of students." Grace saw Celeste's head turn slightly toward the stage. "Since arriving in America," Patricia continued, "Dr. Okonkwo has faced the challenges that so many educated immigrants encounter: credential barriers, systemic obstacles, the painful experience of having your expertise dismissed simply because of where you're from. Despite these challenges, she has never stopped being an educator. She has tutored students in her community without charge, volunteered with the Nigerian Women's Association, and raised 2 exceptional daughters while working tirelessly to provide for them. Brandon was looking at the stage now, too, his expression confused. Dr. Okonkwo holds a master's degree in English literature from the University of Lagos and has published papers on educational equity in international journals. She speaks 3 languages fluently. She has dedicated her life to the belief that education can transform communities, break cycles of poverty, and open doors that seemed permanently closed. Celeste's face had gone pale. She was staring at Patricia with an expression Grace couldn't quite read. Shock, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Grace Okonkwo to the stage. The ballroom erupted in applause. Grace stood, her legs somehow steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She walked to the stage, accepted the Crystal Award from Patricia, and stepped up to the podium. She looked out at the sea of faces, and then she found table 7. Richard had recognized her now. His expression was frozen, caught between confusion and something that might have been embarrassment. Celeste's mouth was slightly open, her eyes wide. Brandon and Sloane were leaning toward each other. Whispering frantically, Grace placed her award on the podium, adjusted the microphone, and began to speak. Thank you, Patricia, and thank you to the Bridge Educational Foundation for this tremendous honor. I stand before you tonight as many things. An immigrant, a mother, an educator, a woman who has lived multiple lives across multiple continents. But more than anything, I stand here as someone who has learned that dignity is not given by others. It is something you carry within yourself, regardless of how the world chooses to see you. Her voice was steady, clear, her accent present and unapologetic. The truth of it silenced them. There was nothing they could say that would undo months of casual cruelty. No apology that would erase the mockery, the dismissiveness, the fundamental disrespect. Grace looked at each of them, Celeste, Richard, Brandon, and felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness exactly, but release. They had taken so much from her over these months, but standing here now in this ballroom, surrounded by people who valued her contributions, she realized they had never actually diminished her. They'd simply revealed their own limitations. I won't be returning to work for you, Grace said. I'm pursuing other opportunities. She didn't wait for their response. She turned back to the group of educators who'd been waiting to speak with her, back to conversations about program development and curriculum design and the work she'd been trained to do. Behind her, the Montgomerys stood in awkward silence before finally retreating to collect their coats. Later, as Grace rode the train back to the Bronx, her award wrapped carefully in tissue paper, she thought about everything that had led to this night. The humiliation, yes, but also the strength she'd found in enduring it. The anger, but also the clarity that came from finally speaking her truth. She thought about Amara's summer program, which she could now afford with the consulting opportunities that had emerged tonight. She thought about the journalist's interview, which would tell her story to thousands of readers. She thought about the dean, who'd asked her to develop a mentorship program for immigrant educators. The Montgomerys had thought they knew who she was. They'd constructed an entire identity for her based on her job title and her accent. They'd never once considered that the woman cleaning their house might have depths they couldn't imagine, accomplishments they'd never match, a story that would outlast their memory of her. When Grace arrived home, both her daughters were waiting up, anxious for news. She showed them the award, told them about the speech, described the standing ovation. What about the family you work for? Amara asked. Were they there? Grace smiled. They were. And they finally saw me. She didn't elaborate. Her daughters didn't need to carry the weight of what the Montgomerys had put her through. What mattered was what came next, the consulting work, the new opportunities, the gradual rebuilding of the professional life she'd been forced to set aside. That night, Grace placed her award on the kitchen table, where she'd spent so many evenings preparing speeches and remembering who she was. In the morning, she would call Patricia to discuss the mentorship program. She would reach out to the contacts she'd made. She would begin, once again, to build a life that reflected her true capabilities. The Montgomerys had tried to make her small, Instead, they'd reminded her how to be large again. And that, Grace thought as she finally drifted off to sleep, was the most fitting response of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.